So this week I have been reading an article that came from an old Time magazine, and is discussing the opioid crisis that's taking place here stateside, right? Now, I didn't even realize that opioids were a problem, even though I'm here, until I was reading some of the information in this article, and it brought me back to the 90s, the early 90s, when I was at that time living and working in New York City, right? And I remember then that my oldest daughter was then probably around 3, and I was living in a very grimy, low-income neighborhood in New York. And if you know how New York is set up, I was living in a studio apartment that was situated above like a storefront, right? So at the time that I moved in, the storefront was empty, and I was in a 3-floor walk-up, right? So I noticed that as time went on, the storefront got rented, and it became a like an outpatient clinic. Now, what I didn't know at the time that it first got rented was that it was a clinic that would service drug addicts. I didn't know that until it actually opened up, and this is what took place. But I do remember that on the first day that it opened, I came downstairs, my usual routine, heading off to drop my daughter to daycare, and then heading off to work. And when I came out from my apartment, I saw a group of people just standing there waiting for the clinic to open. Now immediately I realized that, oh gosh, these are a bunch of junkies, I mean, for all intents and purposes, these were a bunch of drug addicts. You could see by their arms, that they had shot up in their arms, or the marks from that. You could see that some of them, their hands were very fat and thick. Some of the signs of being a drug user. So just generally from their demeanor, that you're dealing with a bunch of crackheads. Back in the 90s, there was a stereotype of the addict, the junkie, the crackhead. The umbrella term is the crackhead, right? Someone up and down in the community, always begging for money, down and out. Someone who'd do anything to get a fix, right? So and I'm just thinking about like comedian Dave Chappelle when he does his skits on the crackhead, or the African-American actor Samuel L. Jackson when he does his portrayals of the crackhead, the junkie. Those were my frame of reference when it came to any kind of contact with crackheads. So I just really wasn't too happy to know that I now was living above a storefront, where they will be gathering once or twice a week. They were there, and really it was for treatment. They were trying to wean themselves off of whatever drug they were on. Primarily, I think, back then, crack and heroine, right? So as the time went on, as the weeks went by, I'd come down once or twice a week, and the crowd or the group would get bigger, right? and they started to kind of line up away from my building. And when I would come out in the morning, some of them would say good morning to me, and I would say good morning back, or they'll wave or say hi to my oldest daughter, who at that point in time was around 3. And they made little comments to her like, go to school and listen to your mum. And in my head I'm like, oh, please don't say anything. But I didn't try to engage more than that. But something happens to you when you start to see this, right? You start to see these addicts, these crackheads, beyond what the stereotype is. And trust me, back in the 90s, there was a major stereotype against being a crackhead. And I did, realize eventually that by coming to this outpatient facility, they were trying to change their lives around, trying to control or get rid of their addiction, right? I'm mentioning that and remembering that for my own life journey, because as I read this article I mentioned, that Time magazine article, I'm thinking about there's a new crackhead in town. There literally is, with this opioid crisis, a new crackhead in town. So I'm thinking that a lot of the scenario that took place in the 90s with the crack epidemic, especially in poor and urban communities, I see it in this article. It's the same, but it's not the same. And that's why I am saying that, or defining this video as 5 things that I am learning from the new crackheads. First, there's a new face of addiction here. The new crackhead has a new face. It's suburban, middle class, and it's white. So this is the new crackhead of the 21st century. Next, there will be no war on drugs in regards to this crack crisis or this opioid crisis, like there was back in the 90s. And there was a real push in the media, in the in policing the urban communities, on there being a real crackdown, what they called the war on drugs. And from reading this article, I don't get the sense that there's going to be that same type of hype or clampdown when it comes to this new crackhead. And I think because it is not urban, it is not black, and it is not poor. What else have I learned from the new crackhead? Oh, that addiction is not due to one having low morals or being innately predisposed to be a criminal. Addiction is based upon the fact that it is a disease. And that's something that was never considered in the 90s with the old crackhead. Everything in terms of their addiction was based upon them being predisposed to being criminals and for them having low morals, and so therefore they found themselves in that situation. Not now, not with the new crackhead. Another thing I have learned is that the addiction can be treated not through prison, not through jail time, but simply through a clinical process of mental and physical treatment centers. And so therefore there are resources that have been set up. They're not just these outpatients, like the one that I remember seeing, back in the 90s, where they'll come in 1 or 2 days a week. Because addiction is now being treated as a disease, now there are inpatient facilities or clinics where the crackhead can go to and spend, a month, a couple of weeks, a couple of months to get treated, for the disease. And one of the last things that I have learned from the new crackheads is that the drug pusher is almost invisible. The drug pusher is really coming from a legitimate source, the doctor's office, the pharmaceutical companies, because unlike crack, when it came into the urban communities back in the 80s and 90s, it came in as pure cocaine, and then it got transformed into this low-level kind of, drug called crack. Unlike that, the crisis now in terms of drug addiction is coming from opiates or opiates, and these are pretty much pre-packaged painkillers that are prescribed to patients. You get them because you go to your doctor and you let him or her know what your condition is, and they prescribe you these opiates. You go to a pharmacy and they fill your order, and that's your drug. It's all above board, it's all legal. So that's one of the last things that I have learned from the new crackhead. And I'm not trying to make fun of drug addiction or crackheads overall. I'm just trying to bring to light that when I read that magazine article and it's talking about a current crisis of addiction in a community, it immediately brought me back to the 90s, and I see some huge parallels between both times, and yet some major differences in terms of how the crisis is being defined and also how it's being handled, and no matter what time frame it is, who the groups are that are impacted, all of us to some degree do get impacted. A crackhead is a crackhead is a crackhead, whether it's crack from the 90s, it's opioids from 2000s, and then maybe in another 20 years something, some other drug, So in hindsight, I'm going to post some information in the description area, because I'd like for those of you who have gone through the experience of seeing how a community is impacted by a drug epidemic, especially the one that I mentioned, crack back in the 80s or 90s, or any other similar experience. I'd like for you to read the article that I read and tell me if you don't see some definite similarities between then and now. And if so, give me your thoughts, give me your feedback in regards to that. So I thank you for sharing your time with me. I hope that my hindsight has and will inspire you, and that you will find your own way to blossom.